Since the turn of the year, the industrial climate in Barbados has been anything but calm, with strike action, work stoppages, and robust negotiations. In this episode of In the Know, General Secretary of Barbados' largest trade union, Toni, shares her concerns on the treatment of workers, calls out delinquent employers, and responds to comments made by other unions. I'm Krystal Hoyte, and this is In the Know. Ms. Moore, thank you for sitting down with me, fresh on the heels of May Day celebrations.
Thanks for having me.
What is your assessment of the industrial relations climate at this time?
I think we are in a very interesting period. The industrial relations situation is one that is very interesting. And I say interesting because we have gone through a period where I think that many workers have been suffering, have been feeling a lot, but not speaking out as much about it. And then enters 2022, late 2022 and into 2023. And what is so significant about that is that it signaled the period where we were pretty much out of COVID and getting back into normalcy. And with that, a lot of workers who were being hailed as being key to the economy, important to their employers, important to consumers, important to keeping the engines of this country running, were finding themselves in a situation where it seemed like people were already forgetting as soon as things started to pick up. So what we are experiencing, and I have no doubt that your question has much to do with the work stoppages and so on that we've noticed earlier this year. And what is really going on is that workers are feeling that they're not getting their fair share. Workers are feeling used. And when people feel used, there's a point at which you decide you won't take it anymore. Enough is enough, and that is what we are experiencing. It is certainly what the union has been encouraging, not that we have been encouraging that workplaces will just cause disruption. But what we certainly encourage in here is after we have reasoned, put ourselves in a position where, come let us reason together, let's see how we can work through things. And you're not going anywhere. What else is left to do? Strike action, work stoppages is still the ultimate or the tool of last resort. And sometimes it becomes necessary. Necessary in some of the situations we have observed. I don't think it was, in that I don't think the situations needed to reach that point. But they did. And in each case, what you saw is workers who gave the long rope and reached the end of their tether and decided enough is enough. Let's take a stand. The union was there ready to walk with them and to stand on their behalf, at least where I speak for this union, because not all of the work stoppages had to do with the BWU. Most of them did, but not all.
Last weekend, you highlighted a number of issues across various sectors, from tourism to construction to retail. What can the union do to address these issues? Or rather, what is the union doing to address these issues?
Well, you heard me make mention of the fact that in a lot of the situations where it reached the point of a work stoppage, that came after consultations had been ongoing for some time. And when there was the recognition that you simply were not getting anywhere. What this union does, our approach to situations is always to resolve them through dialogue, to seek to resolve them through dialogue. And that's what the union has been doing and continues to do. Look to see where we can sit down with human resources managers, heads of companies, boards of directors, if that becomes necessary, and see if we can work through towards a resolution. What often happens is that there's no response. And not that you always expect something to go in your favor. When we say no response, we really mean no reasonable response. No response that's founded in fairness and justice. And when we reach that point, the only other alternative is for workers in that division, as we call them, because we refer to divisions as where we have organized groups of workers in companies, and where the division recognizes as a group, look, we have to take a stand. The Barbados Workers Union is ready with its executive council to support them. What happens in too many situations is that workers don't do that. They want a solution. Man, General Secretary, call out the port, call out Water Authority, call out these bigger organizations to support us. But we can't do that until the workers in the area themselves take responsibility for owning and treating to their own situation. And then the BWU, still the largest union, still the strongest union, will bring out its forces if necessary to support. But our theme, and you would realize we had a theme for me today, it's about you, really is not only intended as our campaign signal or reminder to workers that we are here for you, but your issues, the resolution of your issues, have to do in large part with how you take responsibility and how you stand for yourself in those situations. A good example of that is Duty Free Caribbean, a small group. One of the groups that admitted to me earlier this year when we had to meet on the streets, they admitted to me, look, we felt that the union was about the bigger divisions. But this situation simply got to the point of frustrating because just 6 months prior, if we recap, their company had committed to a particular agreement and then reneged on that agreement. And then in a meeting, denying or attempting to deny that there was agreement or maybe there was misinterpretation around the agreement. And the workers knew differently and they took a stand, and we didn't need to call in anybody else. Kudos to the company. Sometimes a shake-up becomes necessary because once they realized that the workers themselves were willing to stand for what they knew was right, the company responded in short order. And sometimes companies have to be reminded, if people think, even on an individual to individual basis, if some person thinks they could try a thing with you and keep getting off with it, what do you think they can do? They can keep trying a thing. But the moment they realize that you're on the body's fool and you're on plane, is when they start to see you differently. And sometimes the respect we want has to be earned, and we have to remind people of who we are and what we stand for.
What are some of the primary issues that workers complain about?
Well, I can tell you post-COVID, a lot of the issues have to do with contractual arrangements. A lot of people are being put into short-term, uncertain contracts. A lot of people are finding themselves going to work and job descriptions varying themselves or being varied unilaterally. So it's almost like, these times hard and everybody wants a job. And if you want to keep your job, you have to do X or Y or Z, which is not what your job description dictates, but what people are trying to force on you by way of saying that the workplace has to be more multi-skilled or more ready, more nimble. And all this is true, but there's a way to do things. And it is not in any way where you force things onto people, but through dialogue and so on. This union is one that believes in promoting productivity. We believe in having the strongest workforce, the strongest capital that is trained and so on. But social capital is what I'm referring to, that is trained up and so on. But what we also demand is that workers have a say in that change that you're demanding. If you come in on a particular contract and an employer wants to vary it, that's the employer's right, but it's the employer's responsibility as well to have the discussion. Otherwise, you have to find yourself ending that contract and starting a new one. But employers nowadays, what workers are complaining about is having functions forced on them that are not typically what they should be doing. So people are really stretching that any other reasonable duty is being stretched to slipping things on people. So we have those contractual issues. And then we also have a lot of health and safety issues because COVID raised the sensitivity not only to the COVID situation itself, but it raised awareness among workers about other conditions in their workplaces that they need attended to. So these are among some of the issues. You heard me speak on Monday, May Day. You heard me speak about the situation in a supermarket where overtime rates is an issue. You'll find a situation where employers, workplaces tend to be kind to the consumers because the customer is always right, the external customer. But then the internal customer, that person sitting at a cash desk, for your convenience, should that person be separated from their children who they want to look over homework with, who they have to go and prepare for school for the next day, who they have to prepare lunch, push ahead with these conditions in their home? Should they be denied that one for the consumer's benefit and then not be compensated for it in 2023? Should this still be going on? And then you find companies relying on very old terms of a collective agreement that they have failed to renegotiate. They're doing everything else for their convenience unilaterally, but then trying to hold on technical things to deny people their real due. And if in a society as small as Barbados, only 166 square miles, Krystal, we know each other. We go to school with each other. We line with each other. We go to church with each other. And if in a situation where we are such a small unit as a country, and you have people treating to each other in this way, then you understand why it is so significant that Barbados signs on to a mission, makes it now a mission for enfranchising everybody. Because if you are truly about enfranchising people, empowering people, it has to start with the basics that we learned in Sunday school. Do unto others as you will have them do unto you. Love your neighbor as yourself. These foundation principles are missing in the society, and the workplace is reflecting it.
What needs to be put in place to prevent cases where NIS or even union dues are deducted but not paid to the intended agencies?
They want locking up. And I think that we have to come to the point where we start calling out people. I sit on the NIS board, and I'm very aware of where there are offenders. Not a whole lot, but the ones who offend, a whole lot. And it is not only a situation where it creates some sort of imbalance for the worker or for the insured person who goes to take advantage of a benefit and would have to get that benefit delayed. And I say would have to get that benefit delayed because if NIS investigates and so on and recognizes it's not the worker's fault, the NIS, and I commend the officers over at the National Insurance, they try to work around and to facilitate in the fastest possible way that insured person. They should not have to do that. But what I think needs to happen is that the inspectorate needs to be enhanced. And I mean enhanced in terms of numbers and resources. And as I say resources, I don't mean computers and so on. I mean the wherewithal provided for through the legislation that they can go the full gamut, the full route towards bringing justice in a situation.
Is there current legislation?
Under the legislation, the inspectors can call in for the money and so on. And the NIS has teeth that it does not use enough of. And there's also the need for less interference. And I can be honest about it. If you are an offender, nobody shouldn't be giving you a blow because of who you can speak to or who you know. The system has to be allowed to work. But with that said, the inspectors themselves need to use the provisions of the national insurance legislation to bring justice. I have a view that that's one side of it, but as I said at the onset, name and shame. Name and shame. Sometimes that's the most effective tool. And certainly as a trade unionist, we have found that that becomes necessary as the last tool of last resort, but necessary nonetheless. That's what strike action is about. You don't see what is going on behind the scenes in discussions, but you certainly see when a body of workers go outside and then people start to hear about all the issues that they have had. It is fraud. I understand that you can't legislate. You can't legislate integrity and you can't legislate for honesty. That has to be something intrinsic to people. When people are not intrinsically that, the system has to be able to work to benefit the underprivileged that the NIS was set up to deal with, for instance, and the union as a defender of workers' rights.
Ms. Moore, you spoke a lot about legislation, and people have questioned your dual role as trade union leader and MP in the ruling party. What has being on the inside of government allowed you to do more effectively?
I think it speaks for itself. And to the challengers, you would hear me on very few occasions speaking to it because I think that there is a certain degree of hypocrisy that exists within our society. And I only start there because I would have represented the first trade union leader that was not in the lower house of Parliament until 2020, until November 2020. And I don't recall, certainly not in reading any of the transcripts and executive council minutes or other reports from in here that there was any, or the newspaper clippings, because we still have those going back to the 40s and so on. I don't recall there being any challenge given to any other leader. But that's water under the bridge. What I had determined to do while people are talking, I've been ensuring that we set up systems as the executive council in here to make sure that my voice on the inside can make a difference. We've always had a political, or for some time had a political action committee. We have reformulated that so that it is a social, economic, and political committee that informs the kind of things that they would want me to speak to. Look at pieces of legislation and break them down. And beyond just speaking for a half an hour or so in Parliament, seeing how I can exercise any influence through the parliamentary group to get focus on pieces of legislation. So you may or may not have heard me articulating on May Day the positive things that have come. The first thing was the minimum wage. The union had been since the 1950s trying to get a minimum wage in Barbados. Yes, in fairness, the government of Barbados, that is now the government in its manifesto ahead of 2018 elections, has signaled that as well. And they signaled that after rubbing shoulders with the union as well as one of the constituent bases that it would speak to find out what was one of the things that was important to us. But it didn't just happen because it was a manifesto promise. Opportunity presented itself because then I was on the inside and we had the issues that G4S were having toward the end of 2020. And the opportunity presented itself for this union through my voice to be able to say, PM, this might be the time. I know it's COVID and everything, but this might be as good a time as ever to do it. So that was one of the first things that happened. Then we saw amendments to the safety and health at work legislation. Safety and health at work legislation had been enacted since 2005, but yet in terms of interpretation and application, sometimes you find ambiguities that the regulations were there and were able to address. The Trade Union Recognition Act is before the Chief Parliamentary Council. Protection of Wages Act, and that was an issue that came up a lot through the COVID times as well, because as a knee-jerk reaction, a lot of employers started, I don't know if you remember, decreasing workers' wages by 20% and so on, unilaterally, all because, oh, we're in a COVID situation now and we are in a force majeure and we have to do something. And that was happening in some workplaces without social dialogue. We had to be pushing back against that. Toilet facilities and changing room facilities for agricultural workers. There are a number of changes that the record will speak for itself. And a government does good work, and this government does good work, and I will not take it from them. There will be demands that constituent groups will place on a government, and the BWU certainly has been placing those demands, and because there is the political will and the commitment of this government to work for workers, they have been saying yes to many of these demands. As I said, on Monday, everything has not been going smoothly. There's a lot more that we desire. And then, therefore, it means that for me, there's a lot more work that I have to do. And that might not always be behind closed doors, as we've seen the Transport Board. And I'm certain that there are others of my colleagues that have signaled we don't want to see more publicly. But once we can commit to a regime where we can be heard and there is a response, I think that augurs well for the two children of the Right Excellent Sir Grantley Adams.
Ms. Moore, much of our discussion did center around the May Day celebration. C2 Sab was notably absent. Do you have a comment on that?
Now, it's a typical thing for fraternities not to, the ones who are really genuine at least, not to want to speak out against others. So I choose my words very carefully. CETUSAB, the acronym represents the Congress of Trade Unions and Staff Associations of Barbados. The Congress does not exist in the way that it did at its formation, when it had all of the trade unions and most of the associations. I think the only one that may have been late in coming, I might be mistaken, was BAM. Now we have found a situation in which BWU is not in, BSTU is not in, NUPW sits on the fence. APS and BAPS are no longer in. Prison is not in. And when I say not in the Congress. So it means that the Congress is fragmented. And in response to your question that speaks about presence, I only make that reference because the labor movement in its majority was present. The BWU, as the largest union, was present. It was our event. The National Union of Public Workers, as the largest public sector union, was present. And the BSTU, that represents teachers in both the secondary school, as its name suggests, and even some of those in primary schools, was present. And we had the support of the other associations as well, and they would have wished they could pledge their support, some of them who still remain in the Congress, if they had even known about the missions. So I only say that to say that we are at a moment in this country's history where we don't want to wrangle and belabor too much the negatives. I see that there's an opportunity for labor to be a lot stronger, not only in its presence at events, but in terms of how collectively it represents the interests of Barbadians And yes, to your question directly, Setu Saab's absence was perhaps more unfortunate than it was noticeable initially, but there are two areas that we have to work on, because also on May Day, you can't be speaking about stronger together and you're having divisions even in terms of the events that you're having. Our event was certainly one of the largest. This was probably one of the largest May Days that we have had in perhaps over 2 decades even. I've been at the union for almost 2 decades, and it's the largest since I've been here. And it means that even your former question that speaks about my two roles, if you so to speak, we are seeing strength. We are seeing the BW being strengthened, so that issue, I hope that is the last time that I ever have to touch it in any debate, because the BW brand is still out there and it is still strong, and we are seeing influxes in our membership and in terms of responses to what we put out there. So I look forward to the day where Setu Saab will be able to see itself. And the one final thing I would say is that for any organization, organizations go through different peaks and throws, and sometimes it behooves an organization to consider step back from itself. The BW had to do that a few years ago, and we even brought a consultant in to assist with that process. Sometimes you have to step back from yourselves, because very often, sometimes a lot of the fixes are within our capacity to fix, but there just has to be the will to fix it. I think that Setu Saab, at the level of its leadership, needs to do a lot of introspection. And I think that once there's honesty and integrity with that process, positive outcomes will come for all workers.
Ms. Moore, thank you for making the time.
And thank you for having me.